Вот имеете в виду. Бла-бла-бла-бла-бла. Не подточишь. Мозг заточишь, не подточишь. Ладно, я понял, кричи. Кричи, понял, кричи, кричи. Это на себе так говорил. Не стиле чего. Дети хорошо играют. Так, что я хотел там? Завтракать я хотел. Время тратишь напрасно. Я начал, ага, ну сейчас как бы за раз, ага. Оргезр. Оргезр. Извлечь.
Fühlen Sie sich auch vom Auf und Ab der Aktienmärkte überfordert? Hallo, ich bin Harry Weinfurt. Sie kennen mich noch als Moderator von Der Preis ist heiß und wissen, was für tolle Preise meine Kandidaten dort gewinnen konnten. Aber keiner dieser Preise war groß genug, um damit eine sichere Altersvorsorge aufzubauen. Umso mehr freue ich mich heute mit Ihnen ein Geheimnis zu teilen, das Ihnen hilft, den Grundstein für ein Vermögen zu legen. Dieses Geheimnis hat ohne Übertreibung mein Leben verändert. Ja, wirklich. Und wenn es Ihnen so geht wie mir, dann wird diese Entdeckung auch Ihr Leben verändern. Denn wie viele anderen war auch ich auf der Suche nach einer Geldanlage, die lukrativ und sicher ist. Aber ich sage es Ihnen ganz ehrlich, der ständige Rauf und Runter der Aktienkurse macht mich verrückt. Wer soll da noch durchblicken? Zum Glück kenne ich jemanden, der sich mit dieser Geldanlage auskennt. Mein guter Freund Alexander von Pasewalk sagte zu mir, Harry, mach dir doch nicht so einen Stress. Investiere einfach in die 3 Aktien, die langfristiges Gewinnpotenzial haben. Und dann gab er mir seinen neuen Spezialreport mit dem schönen Titel 3 Aktien für die Ewigkeit. Aber der Name ist tatsächlich sehr passend. Einmal die Aktien kaufen und sich dann über den stetigen Wertzuwachs freuen.
This is the subject and answer from the very first fugue in Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier. The first rule of fugal subjects and answers is that a subject that begins on scale degree 1, as here, should be balanced with an answer that begins on scale degree 5, and vice versa. This is an example of a real answer, which I think is a terribly named technical term. There's nothing not real about other kinds of answers. Real in this case simply means that the answer is formed by an exact transposition of the fugue subject, every half step for half step, whole step for whole step, and interval for interval. In order to understand how Bach was able to form a real answer, I will need to get into the topic of the system of transposable hexachords in 18th century solfeggio. At first, it won't be clear why I'm going off on this tangent, but trust me, I think it's the best way to teach fugal theory in the long run. Our modern solfege syllables slowly spread in usage across Europe during the 18th century, but prior to this, and continuing on in fugal pedagogy, musicians thought of the scale as divided into 3 6-note hexachords built on the tonic, dominant, and subdominant scale degrees. All 3 hexachords would be assigned the same arrangement of solfege syllables, do, re, mi, fa, sol, and la. Notice that each hexachord only contains 1 half step, always between the same syllables mi and fa, and that the rest are whole steps. So, when Fuchs in Gradus ad Parnassum refers to the note D as D, La, Sol, Re, he was referring to the note D in the specific context provided by its hexachords. The same note can occur in multiple hexachords, and can therefore have more than one solfege interpretation. Depending on context. Bach is able to form a real answer for his fugue because his subject begins on scale degree 1 and only moves through the vice versa. This is an example of a real answer, which I think is a terribly named technical term. There's nothing not real about other formed by an exact transposition of hexachords spread in usage across Europe during the 18th century. But prior to this, and continuing on in fugal pedagogy, musicians thought of the scale as divided into 3 6-note hexachords built on the tonic, dominant, and subdominant scale degrees. All 3 hexachords would be assigned the same arrangement of solfege syllables: do, re, mi, fa, sol, and la. Notice that each hexachord only contains 1 half step, always between the same syllables mi and fa, and that the rest are whole steps. So, when Fuchs, in Gradus ad Parnassum, refers to the note D as D, La, Sol, Re, he was referring to the note D in the specific context provided by its hexachords. The same note can occur in multiple hexachords, and can therefore have more than one solfege interpretation, depending on context. Bach is able to form a real answer for his fugue because his subject begins on scale degree 1 and only moves through the melodic space of the tonic hexachord, while the answer begins on scale degree 5 and moves through the dominant hexachord. This means that the solfege syllables of the subject and answer are identical, simply transposed from one hexachord into another, outside of the range of the hexachord. Well, we can still form a real answer, but it will require us to use accidentals to form an exact transposition. Here's an example of a fugue subject by Albrechtsberger that begins on scale degree 1 and uses the leading tone in a soprano cadence, 7-1. This leading tone is the only note of the scale that does not exist within the tonic hexachord. In order to create an equivalent leading tone resolution to the last note of the answer, we need to raise the note F to an F sharp. Another fugue subject by Albrechtsberger is an example of what schema theorists have termed a quiescenza. The subject passes through a lowered scale degree 7 and then returns to the tonic through the natural form of the leading tone in the next measure. Pause the video if you'd like to think about how you would form a real answer to this fugue subject. Pause the video if you... in the next measure, and then returns to the tonic through the natural form of the leading tone in the next measure. Through the natural form of the leading tone in the next measure. Another fugue subject by Albrechtsberger is an example of what schema theorists have termed a quiescenza. The subject passes through a lowered scale degree 7 and then returns to the tonic through the natural form of the leading tone in the next measure. Pause the video if you'd like to think about how you would form a real answer to this fugue subject.
Mais c'est pas possible, il n'y a personne. Bon bah alors, soit j'ai réservé tout l'hôtel, soit ils sont prisonniers de leur investissement. Et je ne me souviens pas avoir réservé tout l'hôtel. Commençons par une question. Pourquoi c'est si facile de gagner de l'argent dans les cryptos, mais si compliqué de le garder? Beaucoup de personnes ne le savent pas, mais le...
The B-flat Fa of the subdominant hexachord is answered by Fa in the tonic hexachord, and the leading tone Mi, the dominant hexachord, is answered again by an F sharp. This F sharp would be given the solfege syllable Mi in a hexachord built on D natural. So in general, any sharps that are introduced as an applied leading tone were referred to by Albrechtsberger and others as mi notes, and flats or chromatically lowered notes that have a tendency to resolve downward were referred to as fa notes. Now, the minor mode is where things start to get a little bit weird. Here is a fugue subject in D minor by Albrechtsberger. It's not so hard to figure out the real answer. We simply transpose the subject exactly to begin on scale degree 5. Begin on scale degree. The real answer. We simply transpose the subject exactly to begin on scale degree 5. But what about minor mode solfege syllables? If we look again at our arrangement of the 3 hexachords, we can see that each of the hexachords contains a major triad, formed by the syllables do, mi, and sol. In this example, we can see the 1 chord, 5 chord, and 4 chord from the key of C major. But interlocking with those major triads are a series of minor triads, composed of the syllables re, fa, and mi. In this case, the same hexachords that contained the primary major triads from the key of C major contain the minor triads from the key of D minor. And these are the syllables that would have been used to analyze minor mode melodies relative to the hexachords. I will repeat that the reason I'm going over all of this stuff about solfeggio in a video where I'm supposed to be talking about fugue is because it really will make understanding the reasons behind some of the old rules much easier to understand once we get to them, in this video and in future ones. So far, we've covered real answers, which are, again, simply answers formed by an exact transposition of the fugue subject. Any answer that is not formed by an exact transposition of the subject is known, confusingly, as a tonal answer. Now, they had tonal answers even back in the era of modal music, so just don't think about it too much. Tonal equals not an exact transposition. There are 3 reasons why a fugue subject would require a tonal answer. The first reason has again to do with those hexachords. The C major fugue by J.S. Bach, at the beginning of the video, began on the tonic scale degree and moved through the tonic hexachord, which allowed Bach to use a real answer. Likewise, if a fugue subject begins on the dominant scale degree 5, and moves through the dominant hexachord, it can also easily form a real answer. If a fugue subject begins on the dominant scale degree 5, and moves through the dominant hexachord, it can also easily form a real answer. Tonal answers are necessary when the fugue subject begins on the tonic scale degree, but moves through the dominant hexachord, or conversely, begins on the dominant scale degree but moves through the tonic hexachord. This is because scale degree 5 is the 5th note, sol, of the tonic hexachord, but scale degree 1 is only the 4th note, fa, of the dominant hexachord.
Ну да. Оборот указания.
This means that in these cases, the first note of the subject cannot lie in the same position within its hexachord as the first note of the answer.
If you're worried about the direction of our country, you should pay close attention to this bill that's working its way through Congress, because I believe it will set off the biggest market event of this decade, an event that will destroy the chances of millions of Americans ever having a...
Here is an example subject, yet again by Albrechtsberger, that illustrates the top right corner of the box diagram. It begins on the dominant scale degree 5, but its melodic motion carries it clearly through the space of the tonic hexachord, ending with a tenor cadence on scale degree 1. If we wanted to form a real answer to this subject that began on scale degree 1 and that formed an exact transposition, the answer would need to move through the subdominant hexachord. This was considered undesirable during most of the common practice, since contrast and balancing of scale degree 1 and 5 in a fugue was meant to be paired with a tonal contrast of the tonic and dominant key areas. The subdominant key in this example would usurp a role that conventionally should have been played by the dominant. However, that is not to say that this kind of real answer did not happen. Here is a rather well-known fugue by either J.S. Bach or possibly composed by Johann Peter Kellner, where the composer chooses to allow the answer to veer into the key of the subdominant in order to achieve exactly this kind of real answer. A similar choice was made by Beethoven in the first movement of his string quartet in C-sharp minor. Still, modulating into the subdominant was very rare in fugues, and in both of the cases I just mentioned, I think the composers had special reasons for choosing this uncommon kind of answer within the larger context of their compositions. If we wanted instead to transpose this fugue subject into the dominant hexachord like this, then the answer would have to begin on scale degree 2 instead of scale degree 1, and that isn't much better. The solution proposed by Albrechtsberger is to adjust the first note of the answer to begin on scale degree 1, fa of the dominant hexachord instead of sol, and then to keep the rest of the notes on their correct syllables. Notice that this results in the whole step between G and A in the subject, changing into a leap of a major third between C and E in the answer. Conversely, here is an example that illustrates the bottom left corner of the box diagram. Albrechtsberger's subject begins on the tonic scale degree, but for the most part moves through the dominant hexachord, and ends with a tenor cadence that implies a tonicization of the dominant key. The answer then begins on the dominant scale degree, but moves through the tonic hexachord and cadences on scale degree 1. Notice that this again requires that the distinctive octave leap between the first two notes of the subject be altered to a leap of a minor seventh in the answer. The second reason a subject may require a tonal answer would be in order to redirect a modulation. Here is a fugue subject by J.S. Bach that modulates in the second measure into the key of the dominant, E flat major. One possible answer would be this. Since the subject begins on the dominant and moved through the tonic hexachord, we will need a tonal answer to adjust the first note so that it begins on scale degree 1, just as we explained in the previous chapter of the video. Note, so that hexachord, we will need a tonal answer to adjust the first note so that it begins on scale degree 1, just as we explained in the previous chapter of the video. But after that, we can just keep the transposition exact, right? Not right. If we continue to follow this subject exactly, then the answer would modulate into the key of F major, which is the dominant of E flat. And the subsequent voice entries in the fugue would just keep carrying us further and further from the tonic. So instead, Bach shifts the material after the 16th note rest so that the cadential force is redirected back into the tonic key. As a general piece of advice, be on the lookout for tenor cadences and soprano cadences in your fugue subjects. If one of them occurs and resolves to the dominant scale degree, then the equivalent melodic cadence in the answer should occur over the tonic scale degree and vice versa. In order to maintain a tonal balance scale degree, equivalent melodic cadence in the answer should occur over the tonic scale degree and vice versa. In order to maintain a tonal balance, I think this is the best justification for the name tonal answer. Here is that fugue subject in the answer in its actual context. Notice the sense of balance of first leaving and then returning to the tonic key area. Finally, here is an example that demonstrates the third reason why certain fugue subjects require a not exactly transposed tonal answer.
Наоборот, потому что да.
The answer starting in measure 5 is almost a real answer, except for this note D. If we were to transpose the subjects exactly, this note should have been an E. The subject begins on scale degree 1 and moves through the tonic hexachord, and the subject does not modulate, so what gives? And why is this note specifically the only one that is altered? The reason has to do with the traditional definitions of the modes. Modes were defined not just by their first and final tones, but also by how their octave range is divided. The octave of an authentic mode, like Dorian, was divided into a lower fifth, or pentachord, and an upper fourth, or tetrachord. Plagal modes, on the other hand, such as Hypodorian, were conceived in measure 5. The answer starting in measure 5 is almost a real answer, except for this note D. If we were to transpose the subjects exactly, this note should have been an E. The subject begins on scale degree 1 and moves through the tonic hexachord, and the subject does not modulate, so what gives? And why is this note specifically the only one that is altered? reason has to do with the traditional definitions of the modes. Modes were defined not just by their first and final tones, but also by how their octave range is divided. The octave of an authentic mode, like Dorian, was divided into a lower fifth, or pentachord, and an upper fourth, or tetrachord. Plagal modes, on the other hand, such as Hypodorian, were conceived as having the tetrachord on bottom and the pentachord on top. Fuchs gives these two examples in Gradus ad Parnassum of some fugue subjects that have tonal answers that keep both melodies within the range of an octave, and that help to define the melodic boundaries of their respective modes.
JetBrains Academy, where I create my fully functional applications.
This rule is relaxed quite a bit as the composition continues, but here at the very beginning, composers felt it was important to pair strong, goal-directed motion from the tonic to the dominant scale degrees with a counterbalancing motion from the dominant back to the tonic. Notice that this is true not just of arpeggiation, but also of any kind of strong goal-directed motion between these two key-defining notes. If we look back at the first two key-defining notes, if we look back at the first example from this video, you'll notice that Bach's C major fugue subject does indeed use scale degree 5 3 times, but each time it is only weakly articulated. The first time it occurs as an upper nadir around the note F, and then as part of a sequence, and finally as a passing 16th note. So this answer does not require a tonal adjustment like the last example, since it does not emphasize scale degree 5 as a prominent goal of melodic motion, or treat it as in any way key defining. Let's finish the video by summarizing what we've learned. If any of what I'm about to say doesn't make immediate sense, I would suggest reviewing the appropriate video chapter or leaving a question in the comments section. There are two kinds of fugal answers. Number one, real answers that are formed by an exact transposition of the fugue subject. This can only happen in one of two ways. First, there are real answers that move within the range of the hexachord that matches their starting note, like in the Bach C major fugue. Second, there are real answers that move in the Bach's in the range of the hexachord that matches their starting note, like in the Bach C major fugue. Second, there are real answers that move outside of the range of their respective hexachords and require additional accidentals in order to form an exact transposition. Now, these two kinds of real answers do not sound very different, but they are conceptually different, the latter occurring more frequently later in music history. Tonal answers are those that do not form an exact transposition of the fugue subject, for one of at least three reasons. The first reason is when the first note is shifted due to a mismatch between the starting note and the hexachord through which the answer moves. We saw a couple of tonal answers by Albrechtsberger that behave this way. The second reason would be when a segment anywhere within the answer is shifted in order to redirect a modulation. like in the Bach E-flat major fugue. And the last reason would be when a note near the beginning of the answer is shifted in order to maintain a melodic balance between the pentachordal and tetrachordal boundaries of the mode or scale, as in the first contrapunctus from Bach's Art of Fugue.
Наоборот, да. Да, наоборот, да. Охренеть, просто охренел, да. Наоборот. Да, вот это он имел в виду. Вот это было. Вот это. Наоборот, наоборот, да. Ну да, типа того. Помпио и объелся, объединение это какое прямо хорошо. Надо печатать. Вот это он имеет в виду.